He walked into Harrington Motor Works with a 6-year-old girl on his hip and 32 years of engine knowledge in his hands, and the receptionist looked at him like he'd tracked mud across a marble floor, which, technically, he had. There was still grease under his thumbnail from that morning's timing belt job on a 94 Tercel. He hadn't thought to check. His daughter Phoebe pressed her face into his shoulder and whispered that it smelled like a new car. He whispered back that it smelled like money, which was basically the same thing. Harrington Motor Works sat at the edge of downtown Bracebridge, Ontario, the kind of building that had been designed specifically to make a person feel small before they'd even touched the door handle. Floor-to-ceiling glass, track lighting that probably cost more per fixture than Strickland paid in monthly rent. A showroom floor polished to the kind of shine that reflected your own expression back at you, which was not at that moment a flattering thing. His name was Ben Strickland. He was 41 years old. He owned a garage called Strickland Auto off Muskoka Road, which had 9 bays, 2 hydraulic lifts that needed servicing, a coffee maker that worked when it felt like it, and a part-time employee named Dougie who was 17 and terrifyingly good with electrical systems. Before that, Strickland had spent 11 years as a senior powertrain engineer at a firm in Mississauga, working on prototype development for fleet vehicles and specialty builds. Before that, he'd spent 3 years in a machine shop learning how engines actually worked, not how textbooks said they worked. Before all of that, he'd been a husband. That part had ended 22 months ago. Quietly, the way those things sometimes do, in a hospital room at the end of a Tuesday. He didn't talk about it much. Phoebe was 4 when it happened, and was now 6, and had recently developed the habit of carrying a small red notebook everywhere she went, drawing cars in it during quiet moments, which Strickland chose to interpret as a sign that things were going to be fine. He hadn't come to Harrington Motor Works by choice. He'd come because a man named Carol Ashby had called his garage 3 days ago and asked him to. Ashby was a name that meant something in Muskoka. Not in a loud way, not in the way of people who needed you to know who they were. Ashby was the kind of name that appeared on the donor walls of hospital wings and on the cornerstones of libraries, and occasionally in the Globe and Mail, in items that mentioned endowments and conservation trusts. Carol Ashby was 73, had made his money in commercial real estate before pivoting to private equity in the late 90s and owned, among other things, a collection of 17 significant automobiles housed in a climate-controlled facility on his property outside of town. He had not called Strickland himself. His assistant had called a woman named Frederica, who spoke in the patient, precise way of someone who had been managing complex logistics for decades and had strong opinions about other people wasting her time. She explained that one of Mr. Ashby's vehicles, a 1966 ISO Grifo A3L, had developed a mechanical problem that was proving resistant to diagnosis. The vehicle had been in the care of Harrington Motor Works for 6 weeks. The team there had, Frederica said carefully, been unable to resolve the issue to Mr. Ashby's satisfaction. Mr. Ashby had been given Strickland's name by a mutual acquaintance. Which acquaintance? Strickland had asked. Ted Kowalski, Frederica said. He said you rebuilt a Ferrari 250 GTE for him a few years ago. It wasn't a full rebuild. It needed a new crankshaft and the head gaskets were gone. Mr. Kowalski seemed to feel that was significant. Strickland had looked around his garage at that moment. Dougie was lying under a Subaru Forester with his headlamp strapped to his forehead. The coffee maker was making its bad sound. Phoebe was sitting on an overturned bucket in the corner doing her homework, which she'd taken to doing at the garage on Tuesdays because her after-school pickup situation had gotten complicated since the fall. Tell me about the Grifo, Strickland said. Frederica told him. He said he'd come and have a look. The Grifo was one of the most beautiful cars ever built, which was a fact that automotive people said with the quiet conviction of people who believed it, but understood it was not universally appreciated. ISO Rivolta had been an Italian manufacturer operating out of Bresso in the 1960s, producing a small number of grand touring cars that used American V8 engines in Italian coachwork, which was a combination that should not have worked as well as it did. The A3L variant used a Chevrolet 327, the same engine that came in a Corvette, and wrapped it in a body designed by Bertoni that was long and low and moved through the air like it was remembering a promise it had made to someone. There were fewer than 500 ever made. Working, documented examples changed hands for serious money. Non-working examples changed hands for slightly less serious money and significant quantities of ambition. Harrington Motor Works had told Ashby the problem was in the carburation system. They'd replaced the carburetors twice. The car had started both times, run for a few minutes, and then begun exhibiting the same symptom, a rough idle that worsened under load, accompanied by an intermittent hesitation at mid-range RPM that had the character of a fuel delivery issue but didn't respond to any fuel delivery adjustments. The second time it happened, the engine had stalled and would not restart. Their lead technician had, according to Frederica, described the car as persnickety in ways that require specialized vintage expertise beyond our current capacity. Strickland had translated this in his head before Frederica finished the sentence. It meant, "We don't know what's wrong with it, and we don't want to keep guessing on a car this valuable." It was, he had to admit, a sensible position. He had been in that position himself. He walked through the showroom with Phoebe on his hip and his grease-stained thumbnail and the receptionist's expression, and he asked for the service manager. The service manager's name was Tobin. He was perhaps 35. With the careful grooming of a man who had decided that presentation was a professional tool, and he greeted Strickland with the particular warmth of someone who had not been told he was coming and was working out in real time how to categorize him. "You must be from Strickland Auto," Tobin said, because he had good instincts if nothing else. "Ben Strickland," Strickland said, and shifted Phoebe to his other hip so he could shake Tobin's hand. Tobin looked at Phoebe. Phoebe looked at Tobin. She had her red notebook tucked under her arm. "My usual Tuesday arrangement fell through," Strickland said. "She's quiet." "Of course," Tobin said in the tone of a man who was recalibrating. "The Grifo is in Bay 7. We've had it since April. I know. Can I see the service records?" Tobin had printed them already, which meant Frederica had called ahead, which meant Ashby's people were more organized than Harrington's people had expected to have to deal with. The stack of records was substantial. Strickland took them with his free hand and started reading while Tobin led them through to the service floor. The car was there, even under the fluorescent lights of a service bay, even surrounded by newer, shinier vehicles that cost twice as much, even with its hood up, and a diagnostic cart parked next to it and the general air of a patient who had been in the hospital too long. Even then, the Grifo stopped him. Phoebe said, "Wow," very quietly against his shoulder. "Yeah," Strickland said. He set her down on a stool someone had left near the workbench and handed her the red notebook. "Draw that," he said, nodding at the car. She opened the notebook and started drawing. She drew the way she did most things. Seriously, without a lot of preamble. Strickland put on the gloves he'd brought in his jacket pocket and started going through the records. 2 hours. That was how long he spent before he said anything to Tobin, who had hovered for the first 20 minutes and then retreated to a respectful distance and spent the rest of the time doing other things while clearly paying attention. The records were thorough. That was the first thing Strickland noticed. Harrington's team had not been careless. They'd done the obvious things in the right order. New Holley carburetors, correctly jetted for the 327 at this altitude. Fuel pump pressure tested and within spec. Fuel lines clear, points and condenser replaced, timing set correctly, coil tested, plug wires new. The things you did when an old V8 was running badly, done in the order you did them, documented carefully. And none of it had fixed the problem. Strickland went through it all twice. He looked at the dates. He looked at the sequence. And then he put the records down and stood with his hands on the car's fender and looked at the engine and thought about what wasn't in those records. What wasn't in those records was anything about the distributor itself. The cap and rotor had been replaced, which was noted, but the distributor body, the advance mechanisms, the vacuum canister, those weren't mentioned anywhere. Harrington's team had treated the ignition as functional and focused on fuel, which was logical. The symptoms pointed to fuel. But Strickland had seen this before. Once, on a 327 in a 67 Camaro belonging to a man in Huntsville, and once on a 283 in a Biscayne project that had taken him 3 weekends to sort out. The vacuum advance canister on these old distributors could develop a slow failure mode that presented almost exactly like a carburation problem. The diaphragm would degrade internally, leaving the canister appearing intact from outside while intermittently losing the ability to hold vacuum. which caused exactly the kind of load-dependent hesitation and idle roughness that the records described, and which would not respond to carburetor adjustments, because the carburetor was not the problem. He pulled the vacuum line off the advanced canister and attached a hand pump to it. It held for 3 seconds. Then it dropped. The diaphragm was gone. He stood there for a moment. Then he found Tobin. "The distributor vacuum advances failed," he said. "Internally. The diaphragm is degraded. From outside it looks fine. There's no visible damage to the canister. But it can't hold vacuum, which means ignition timing is wandering under load. The carburetors are probably fine." Tobin was quiet for a moment. "We didn't check that. It's not the first place you'd look," Strickland said. "The symptoms point away from it. But this is a common failure on old Delco distributors, and it mimics fuel problems well enough to send you in the wrong direction." Tobin looked at the car. "Can you fix it?" "I'd want to source the right part. This distributor shouldn't be swapped out entirely. It's probably original to the car, and the car's value is partly tied to its matching components. There are rebuild kits for the advance mechanism. I'll need to find the right diaphragm for this specific unit." He paused. "I can probably have it running by tomorrow night, but I'd want to do it in my shop. I've got a vacuum gauge set up there that I'm more comfortable with." He watched Tobin work through whatever he was working through. "Mr. Ashby wanted this car for his exhibition next weekend," Tobin said. "It's the centerpiece. We told him in May that we'd have it sorted by June. It's now the 17th. "I know what date it is," Strickland said, not unkindly. "I'll need to call him," Tobin said. "That's fine," Strickland said. "I'll give you my number." Frederica called him back within the hour, while he was driving Phoebe home for dinner. She said Mr. Ashby would like to meet him before authorizing the vehicle to be moved. Strickland said that was reasonable. She said tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, at Mr. Ashby's property. Phoebe fell asleep in the back seat with her notebook open on her lap to a drawing of the Grifo that was, for a 6-year-old, startlingly accurate in proportion. He made pasta when they got home. He answered 3 emails from parts suppliers while the water boiled. He thought about the distributor. He thought about the specific diaphragm he'd need, and where he was likely to find one quickly. And he made a list on his phone of 3 suppliers and 1 collector he knew in Barrie, who had a warehouse full of vintage GM components and owed Strickland a favor from a crankshaft situation 2 years prior. After Phoebe was in bed, she had negotiated for 1 more page of her book, which he had agreed to on the condition that she actually turned the light off afterward, which she sometimes did and sometimes didn't. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the folder of records he'd asked Tobin for permission to take. His wife had used to sit across from him at this table. She'd drunk tea the same way he did, black, which was something he'd never thought to think about when she was alive, because it was such a small thing, and now he thought about it sometimes in the evening when there was no one across from him, and the tea was the same and everything else wasn't. He put that away and went back to the records. Ashby's property was outside Bracebridge proper, off a road that wound between old pines, and the vehicle facility was behind the main house. A purpose-built structure that was bigger than Strickland's entire garage and considerably better insulated. Ashby himself met him at the door. He was smaller than Strickland had expected. People with large names sometimes were. He was trim, wore a plain gray sweater, and shook Strickland's hand with the directness of someone who had learned that small talk was not actually a prerequisite for getting things done. "The Grifo," Ashby said without preamble. "Vacuum advanced diaphragm," Strickland said. "Failed internally. Not visible from outside. Harrington had it 6 weeks. They did the right checks in the right order. This failure is unusual. It presents as fuel-related, and it isn't." Ashby looked at him. "You found it in 2 hours. I've seen it before." He paused. "Twice, both times on 327s. Ashby nodded slowly. He walked into the facility and Strickland followed. The other vehicles were there. 16 of them, arranged with the care of someone who understood that a collection is not an accumulation. It's a conversation. A 1954 Bentley Continental, an early Porsche 356 in silver gray, a Lancia Aurelia Spider that made Strickland feel something in his chest he didn't have a ready word for, a Ford GT40 in Gulf livery that was either a very good replica or the real thing, and given what he knew about Ashby, he suspected the latter. "My wife helped me find most of these," Ashby said. He was looking at the GT40. "She had a better eye than I did. She'd walk into a sale and know within 10 minutes which car had the history and which one was pretending. She passed? Strickland said. He hadn't known that, and was aware as he said it that it was presumptuous. But the past tense was in Ashby's voice the way it got into things, the way it had gotten into Strickland's voice. 4 years ago. Ashby looked over at him. You've got a daughter, Phoebe. She's 6. He paused. Her mother died 22 months ago. Ashby didn't say he was sorry. He nodded. It was, Strickland thought, the better response. The exhibition next Saturday is partly in her name, Ashby said. A fundraiser. The Grifo was hers. She found it at an estate sale in Hamilton in 2011 and called me before she'd even left the parking lot. He stopped. I don't want a substitute vehicle. I want that car. It'll be there, Strickland said. He picked up the diaphragm kit from the collector in Barrie, who was named Gus Pelham, and who had strong opinions about everything and was almost always right, and who sold him the correct part for a 1966 Delco unit at a fair price, and threw in 2 extra point sets, for reasons he didn't explain, but that Strickland accepted, because you never had too many point sets for this era of GM distributor. He had the Grifo in his shop by Thursday morning. Dougie came in at noon and stood next to it for approximately 30 seconds in complete silence before saying, Is that what I think it is? Yes, Strickland said. Where did you find it? Local collection. It needs the advance mechanism rebuilt. The diaphragm's gone. Dougie crouched down and looked at the engine from the side. He was 17 and 6'1" and had the particular combination of genuine aptitude and complete lack of pretension that Strickland had found, in his experience, to be the most useful trait a mechanic could have. I've never seen one of these in person, Dougie said. Most people haven't. Can I watch? You can help, Strickland said. Wash your hands first. Phoebe arrived at 4, deposited by Dougie's mother, who sometimes helped with Tuesday-Thursday logistics, and who Strickland paid in casseroles, which had been her suggestion and which he'd accepted because he'd learned that accepting help was not the same as needing it. Or anyway, he was still learning that. She set up her homework on the parts table, cleared specifically for this purpose, and worked through her reading while Strickland reassembled the distributor. The advance mechanism was the delicate part. The diaphragm itself was straightforward to replace, but the whole assembly needed to be reset correctly, and the advance curve tested before the distributor went back in, because putting a distributor back in without verifying the advance was how you ended up with a car that ran worse than before. Phoebe looked up from her book at one point and watched him work for a while. Is that the broken part? She said, pointing at the diaphragm he'd removed. That's it. She looked at it. It was a small rubber disc, maybe 6 centimeters across, with a crack in the membrane that was almost invisible until you held it to the light. It's very small, she said. It is. Did they not see it? They weren't looking for it, he said. They were looking at other things. She thought about this. She had a habit of processing information seriously before she responded, which he recognized as her mother's way of doing things, and which undid him sometimes when he was tired. So you have to know what to look for, she said. That's part of it. She went back to her book. Dougie, across the bay, looked up from the Subaru he'd been working on and gave Strickland a look that he chose not to interpret. The distributor was back in the car by 9 that night. He let it warm up slow, easing it through idle until the temperature needle climbed. No rough running, no hesitation. He brought the RPM up through the range where the problem had lived, and the engine responded cleanly. The 327 settling into the deep burble that these engines made when they were right. A sound that was, if you'd grown up around old American V8s, almost unreasonably satisfying. He sat in the empty bay for a moment after he shut it down, in the quiet that followed. The shop smelled like old oil and fresh coffee. Dougie had made a pot before he left, and through the window he could see the parking lot and the dark road beyond it, and the pines at the edge of the lot standing in the night air. He thought about Ashby's wife, who had called from a parking lot in Hamilton in 2011 with a car she already knew was the right car. He thought about his own wife, who had never been much interested in cars, but had learned the names of most of the ones in his shop because she had understood that knowing the names of things mattered to him. He thought about Phoebe in her bed at home, with the red notebook on the nightstand and the chapter book her teacher had recommended. He didn't let himself sit there too long. Long enough He delivered the Grifo to Ashby's property on Friday afternoon. He drove it himself. He'd asked, and Ashby had said yes. It wasn't something you would normally do, drive a client's vehicle on an open road. And he'd kept below 60 the whole way and taken the smoothest line through every turn. But the car tracked straight and pulled clean through the RPM range, and the engine note through the quarter windows was exactly what it was supposed to be. Frederica met him at the facility gate. He was not sure what he had expected, but she was perhaps 60. With the calm authority of someone who had been the most organized person in every room she'd ever entered and had long since made peace with this fact, she handed him a clipboard with a condition form, and he went through the car carefully before signing and noting two small things: a scrape on the lower passenger rocker that predated his involvement, and a slight unevenness in the driver's door weather stripping, which he documented without being asked. Ashby came out while he was doing this. He walked around the car without speaking, the way someone does when they're looking for something they want to find. He crouched down to look at the rocker scrape. He opened the driver's door and listened to the sound it made closing, which was the sound of a well-fitted door on a well-made car. He reached in and started the engine. He let it idle. The 327 sat at a steady 700 RPM, which was where it wanted to be, which was where it had not been able to stay for 6 weeks. He put it in gear and moved it forward 6 feet and back 6 feet and shut it off. He got out and looked at Strickland. "My wife bought this car for $11,000 in 2011, Ashby said. The man who sold it to her thought she was bluffing. Was she? She never bluffed about anything in her life." He paused. "What do I owe you?" Strickland told him the rate. Parts at cost, labor at his shop rate, which he had not raised since he'd opened. It was, given the circumstances, a number that Ashby clearly found unexpected. Not high, but lower than expected. And Strickland watched him understand this and choose not to remark on it directly. "Harrington charged me 3 times this, for 6 weeks of work that didn't fix it," Ashby said. "I know what's standard," Strickland said. "That's my rate." Ashby wrote him a check on the spot. He was one of the few people Strickland had met in recent years who still carried a checkbook and used it without self-consciousness, and handed it over. The amount was considerably more than Strickland had quoted. "The difference is a donation to whatever your daughter's school needs," Ashby said, "or to something she cares about. I don't need a receipt." Strickland looked at the check. He thought about saying something. He folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. "The exhibition," he said. "What time Saturday?" 7 in the evening, Ashby said. "You should come. Bring Phoebe." Strickland looked at the Grifo sitting in the light of the facility and at the GT40 beside it, and the Lancia beyond that. He thought about his daughter in her best dress. She had one, blue with small white flowers, purchased for a cousin's wedding last fall, standing in this room with her red notebook. "I'll ask her," he said. Saturday evening, Phoebe wore the blue dress and brought the red notebook. She shook Ashby's hand when they were introduced, which she did with the seriousness she applied to most things. And Ashby showed her the GT40 first, which was the right call, because even at 6 she understood instinctively that it was something remarkable, and stood very still in front of it for a long moment before she opened the notebook and started drawing. The exhibition ran until 10. There were perhaps 60 people, the kind of crowd that came because they knew the cars or knew the cause or both. A string quartet played in one corner. Someone from the Conservation Trust gave a short speech about the late Mrs. Ashby's involvement in the land preservation work she'd funded. Strickland stood near the Grifo for a portion of the evening, because people kept stopping to look at it, and he found he liked listening to what they said. The way people talk about beautiful things when they think no one is paying close attention. A man perhaps 10 years older than Strickland stopped beside him at one point and looked at the car for a while. "It's running again," the man said. "Ashby mentioned it was sorted." "It was a distributor issue," Strickland said. The man looked at him. "You're the mechanic." "Strickland. Ben Strickland." "I've heard the name," the man said, which was either true or polite and didn't much matter which. "Harrington's team couldn't find it." "It was a specific failure," Strickland said. "Uncommon presentation." "Still," the man said. They stood there for a moment. They stood there for a way that people do when there's nothing more to say, but the thing itself is worth standing near a little longer. Across the room, Phoebe was sitting cross-legged on a bench beside the Lancia spider with her notebook, drawing, and Frederica was sitting next to her, looking at the drawings with an expression of genuine interest. Phoebe was explaining something. She had her hands moving the way she did when she was explaining something she cared about. He watched this for a moment. The 327 wasn't running. The cars were still and quiet in the careful light. But he could hear it anyway. The way you can hear something that ran right after a long time of running wrong. Not the engine, but the sound underneath it, the settling of a thing back into what it was supposed to be. He watched his daughter explain her drawing to a woman she had met 40 minutes ago, and the woman leaned in to look, and Phoebe said something that made Frederica laugh. And the room was warm and the cars were beautiful, and outside the pines stood against the June sky in the long northern evening light. Strickland put his hands in his pockets and stood there. He thought, "All right,